Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Morton, and I am the Community Assistance Manager here at MHP. Welcome to our first timers and welcome back to our repeat guests to MHP's web series, More Than Compliance, Multifamily Districts That Work in Your Community. This is the final session of this 10-week series. Graciously sponsored by the Bar Foundation, this series is an important part of MHP's Technical Assistance Program for MBTA communities. In previous sessions, we talked about the benefits of complete streets and neighborhoods bring to communities, water and wastewater basics for MBTA communities, encouraging family-friendly housing in MBTA districts. We also provided guidance on action plans and technical assistance available for MBTA communities. We explored housing at different densities, analyzed siting your district for adjacent communities, discussed making the case for affordable housing, and we walked through a site plan review. Today will round us off as we discuss including affordability in your MBTA district. Today's speakers are Alexis Smith and Emma Battaglia of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC. Alexis is a principal housing planner at MAPC, where she works with municipalities to expand and diversify housing options and meet local housing needs. She uses financial and build-out analysis to help communities advance their goals through policies that are feasible and implementable. She is a registered architect and has previously worked for a variety of affordable housing developers in design, planning, and development roles. She has a Master's of Community Planning degree from UC Berkeley and a Bachelor of Architecture from Carnegie Mellon University. Emma joined MAPC's Housing Division as a Senior Housing and Land Use Planner in September 2021. With expertise in municipal planning, affordable housing programming, and graphic design, Emma assists cities and towns in addressing their housing challenges as they become more inclusive and equitable places. Emma oversees a variety of planning initiatives, including housing production plans, neighborhood vision plans, and zoning updates, and currently manages the Metro Mayor's Housing Task Force. Previously, she worked as a senior planner for the city of Melrose. Emma holds a Master's of Urban Planning from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from Cornell University. With that, I will turn it over to MAPC's team.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? Okay, good. Thank you so much for welcoming Alexis and I back for our second webinar. Our last one was on family housing, and that was really fruitful, and we had some great questions that came out of that. So we are happy to be back here to talk about how you can include affordability in your MBTA districts. We will start with some background on what we mean by affordable housing, especially the difference between deed-restricted affordable housing and what we refer to as naturally occurring affordable housing. We'll talk about the housing need in Massachusetts and the greater Boston region, particularly the affordable housing need. We will talk about what 3A requires versus kind of its inherent objectives around affordability and transit access. We will get into some tools for creating mixed income neighborhoods. And then most importantly, we will hear from some of the staff in the field who are implementing these policies that are trying to encourage affordability in their communities. And we'll hear from staff from the town of Reading and the city of Watertown. The layperson generally thinks of affordable housing as housing that fits in their budget. Here we are talking about what planners generally refer to as capital affordable housing. So that's housing that has a deed restriction that requires it to be affordable to low income residents, and it's generally sold at 30% of the household income. These restrictions are really crucial. They ensure the long-term protection against skyrocketing costs, and this is really what helps low-income households stay in their communities and prevents displacement, because they otherwise are at the whim of a landlord who may be charging more cost-appropriate rents, and then they increase, and that family then it doesn't have an option for staying in that home. And also, the affordable housing units that we are talking about here are units that would be allowed to be included on the subsidized housing inventory, which I will speak a little bit about later. So much of this policy is set around what HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, determines as its annual income limits for each metro region. So the numbers I'm showing here are just for the Boston, Cambridge, Quincy metro area. And so I acknowledge that there are probably some other metro areas that are represented on this call who are outside of this area. And I would assume that these numbers are probably a bit lower in those other areas. But what we could see is that, you know, area median income is really high. The median family income for the region as of 2022 is $140,200. So we see that that's really high, and that translates into, you know, the household size and thus income level that they are able to make in order to qualify. So the income limits they set are at extremely low income, which is 30% AMI, very low income, which is 50% AMI, and 80%, which is just generally speaking low income. And even though only units up to 80% are eligible for inclusion on the SHI, that doesn't necessarily restrict communities from setting income levels higher if they want to enable the creation of workforce housing units. So they are not as affordable to the lower income households, but they do have that protection against the skyrocketing rents because they only can go up by a certain amount each year. There are countless benefits to affordable housing. Number one, it allows residents to stay in their communities long-term. Because of the deed restrictions and the way affordable housing is regulated, there are fewer evictions, and there's also less of a need for households to have to leave their home because they can't find housing in their price range, have to leave their community. Affordable housing supports the local and regional economy because it provides housing for our workers. It increases spending power for the people who live in affordable housing, because if less of that money has to go towards their monthly housing expenses, that's more money that they could then spend out in their community. It also creates job opportunities. Affordable housing contributes to family and community stability and helps mitigate gentrification. It also improves social determinants of health. So these are the conditions in our environments where people live, work, and spend time that really have an impact on people's health and well-being and quality of life. And it also promotes diversity and neighborhood vitality. Affordable housing need. Not to be alarmist, but we are in a housing crisis, most specifically an affordable housing crisis. This is really due to the high demand. We've never had demand that's been higher, and a housing shortage. And this is largely because we are just not producing housing nearly at the rates that we used to. And basic economics tells us that when you have this supply and demand imbalance, you're going to increase your costs. And this leads to increased rental costs and sales costs for ownership units. There's also just this mismatch between the types of housing and the different needs of households. So a community may be building large homes and subdivisions, but that doesn't necessarily meet the needs of small households or families who can't afford a single family house, or families who, you know, need access to transit. We have seen really, really large increases in sales, median home sales prices across the state, just in the last couple of years. And obviously the pandemic only accelerated that growth, with, in some cases, seeing more than the median for single family homes, going up to $485,000 across the state. And obviously this puts homeownership farther out of reach for people who have lower incomes. In terms of median rents, this is just across Greater Boston in the MAPC area, because this was data pulled from MAPC's rental listings database, which basically scrubs data from Craigslist and all the different apartment listing sites to actually get real numbers of what units are being listed at. And we saw that there was some relief that happened during the pandemic in terms of rents going down a bit, but this was very much temporary. And now rents are back up and, in some cases higher than they were before the pandemic. And, I think once we have more complete numbers for 2022, I think we'll see that, the numbers are even higher. Vacancy rates, basically a figure that says how many units are, how much of the housing stock is vacant at any one time, but also factoring in the fact that sometimes units do stay vacant. Sometimes landlords have an incentive to keep a unit vacant. Sometimes, there are extenuating circumstances, so vacancy rates take that into account. But we see that the rates are well below healthy rates and they're continuing to decrease. So a healthy homeowner vacancy rate is, kind of hovers around 3%, and we're a lot below that. And really the biggest one that we see as a huge issue is the rental vacancy rate, because a healthy rental vacancy rate is around between 5 and 7%. And so we are seeing that those numbers are getting into very unhealthy territory, which basically means that there's more competition over a limited inventory. There's few homes available to rent or buy at any one time. And unfortunately, it's households with lower incomes who are, most significantly impacted by this, because when you have this competition, you have these cost increases, this is the group that has the least wiggle room. Whereas households that have higher incomes, their costs might be going up, but they can still handle that more than other households. I just want to flag a couple of the findings from the Greater Boston Housing Report Card, because it was a really great report. I encourage you all to check it out if you have not. And I'm just going to run through these quickly, but they essentially found that housing costs are increasing faster than incomes, especially for the poorest third of families. Almost half of Boston renters, Greater Boston renters, are housing cost burden. This means that they're paying at least 30% or more of their annual or monthly costs on housing expenses. So that could be rent, mortgage, utilities, etc. More than 1/3 of Black and Latino homeowners are housing cost burden, even though generally we see that cost burdens tend to be lower for homeowners. We saw that the pandemic drove the largest single year increase in renter cost burden since 2006. That was a 5.6% increase just in 1 year. Over the past 15 years, these cost burdens have increased steadily for low-income households. And, these cost burdens are up across all community types. It's not just one area of the region. So when we think about how many affordable units that we currently have and the number of households that would be eligible for one of these units, we see a really big gap. There are, approximately like 250,000 units on the SHI. And so I want to caution that doesn't necessarily mean affordable housing units total, because some of the units on the SHI are market rates ones that have just been permitted as a part of a rental development. And so all of those units are allowed to count on the SHI. So even with this number, say all of the SHI units were actually affordable, they're still like 75%, more than 75% of all the low income households are unmet, by affordable housing. And so we see that as a huge need. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Alexis, who is going to 3A requirements and then the tools for creating mixed income neighborhoods.
Right. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here and thank you for being here. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So as you all are we're well aware by this point, a lot of what we're talking about is based in DHCD's guidance around Section 3A. And I assume most folks have heard at this point that in October, DHCD issued revised guidelines that specifically addressed affordability requirements in 3A districts. And this was in response to a lot of feedback that they had gotten on the subject. And so again, after hearing from folks in municipalities and other organizations, they revisited this piece. So make sure that when you are looking at the guidelines and planning your district, make sure that you're looking at the revised guidelines from October 21st. Those are the ones all up on the website and all that, but just make sure that that you're referring to these new guidelines now. So as with, many of the 3A guidelines, we've got our baseline requirement, which is what's explicitly spelled out in the guidelines. And that is essentially that Section 3A does not require municipalities to encourage or to include affordability in their 3A districts. So you could have a 3A district that does not reference affordability at all, and and assuming all the other pieces were compliant, it would be compliant. However, we MAPC, other state agencies strongly encourage you all to consider how to incorporate affordability into a 3A district. 3A districts are going to be these great places with transit access and with vibrant communities, all the things that we've been talking about through this webinar series about creating walkable, vibrant communities, and folks of all incomes should have access to that. And so again, we strongly encourage affordability, the inclusion of affordability requirements to the greatest extent possible. Not required, but very encouraged. So there's a couple of things that going on with affordability and the requirements. As a baseline, any 3A district can include a requirement of up to 10% of units affordable to households earning 80% AMI or higher, 80% area median income or higher. And that's from the slide that Emma previously showed. That's what's considered low income. And that is automatically approved, that piece doesn't require any supplemental approvals. Again, assuming the rest of the district is compliant, that you can automatically include 10% of units affordable to 80% AMI as part of the 3A affordability requirements. However, many communities are interested in going beyond that. Many communities already have inclusionary zoning that applies to their entire municipality that goes beyond that, either in terms of asking for more than 10%. A lot of towns and cities have a 15% affordability requirement, or affordability that goes deeper than 80% AMI. In many lower income communities, 80% AMI is quite high and well above the local median. And so cities and towns are saying, listen, that's not necessarily going to meet our need. We want to look at how to serve folks more in the 50 or 60% AMI level. And so if you are interested in going beyond that, that is, well, actually, I'm going to get to that in a second. And then, the last bullet point here is that one of the changes is that the affordable units in 3A districts are not required to be eligible for this subsidized housing inventory, which essentially, the upshot of that is that municipalities can also ask for affordability above 80% AMI, and municipalities in very expensive areas Again, some already have inclusionary requirements that go above 80% AMI. Some may be interested in that because in very, very expensive markets, in Boston, close to the inner core, even 80% AMI is, folks who are at 100 to 120% AMI are having just as hard a time finding housing. And so there is that option to meet that middle income need and provide middle income housing as well. Next slide, please. So getting back to what I got ahead of myself earlier. If a municipality is interested in going beyond a 10% of unit, a requirement beyond 10% of units, or at affordability levels deeper than 80% AMI, there are a couple different ways to do that. First of all, if the municipality is part of it, or has as part of a DHCD program. For example, if you have a 40R smart growth district in place that already requires 20% of units, 20% affordable units, then you can get approval through that program. Likewise, if you are a gateway city and have some sort of affordability requirement tied into your housing development incentive program, then there is then that would be a mechanism to achieve deeper affordability. For folks who don't fall into those categories, which is probably most municipalities, there is a pathway to achieve to pursue greater or deeper affordability, and that would be for the municipality to demonstrate that the affordability requirement doesn't adversely impact feasibility. Through a feasibility study. And because these changes to the guidelines are newer than the first set of guidelines that came out, DHCD is still figuring out exactly what that's going to look like. I know there are some folks from DHCD on the call. So Nate, if you want to throw anything else in there, please feel free to jump in or raise your hand and we'll unmute you. But for now, I'll just say, there will be more coming. There will be more specific guidance on on what tools to use and how to accomplish that. But I just want to emphasize right now that there is a path to require greater affordability, and I strongly encourage folks to consider it. The intent is for it to be for that to not be a barrier to requiring more affordability. Next slide, Emma. Thanks.
Is Becky from DHCD? No.
Oh.
Someone has their hand raised.
We have confirmation from Nate from DHCD. Thank you, Nate. That more information from DHCD will be coming soon. So as everyone has been saying throughout this, this is a phased rollout. This is a very, very substantial change. There's a lot of stuff going on, and so rather than dump everything at us all at once, DHCD is releasing pieces in phases so that we have a chance to digest everything as we go along. And so again, one of the next pieces of information that will be released is this feasibility analysis piece. So again, thanks for everyone's patience throughout the phased rollout. Here we go. So those are the requirements. But again, this is just kind of getting at what Emma has already referenced and what people have been saying throughout all of these webinars. Beyond and the series of the point of this webinar series is, I think the title, beyond compliance. You can comply with 3A by not providing any affordability at all. You could comply with 3A by requiring 10% of units at 80% AMI. But there's also, strongly encourage you in this case in particular to consider how to go beyond that compliance. Again, transit-oriented development located close to transit is in high demand. And it is a real critical part for any household to be able to access jobs, access amenities. And it's doubly true for folks who may be lower income and may not have access to 2 cars or 1 car even, and who may be particularly relying on public transit. And so again, just really want to emphasize to think about and what folks' needs will differ by community. we've been saying before, in lower income communities, the needs might be focused more on getting as deep affordability as possible. In more suburban municipalities, a lot of the need might be, you know what, we just need affordable units by transit. So I mean, again, thinking about exactly what that need means will vary by community. But you know, we want to see these communities be equitable and inclusive. And the way to accomplish that is through, equitable TOD is, you know, by ensuring that affordability is part of these districts. So I'm not gonna read this out loud, but you know, there's a beyond TOD, there's a whole concept called equitable TOD, and I encourage you to check it out. So how to do this? Creating mixed income neighborhoods. Just in general, you all are, I think most of the people on this call are local planners. You all know what the barriers are to any sort of development and affordable development in particular. But just, you know, very quickly, one of the, you know, creating using the private market to help create affordability has a couple of challenges in particular. The biggest one being development feasibility. A lot of communities that I work in, when I'm, you know, helping them craft inclusionary zoning ordinances, you know, start by saying, well, we really want, you know, 30% of our units at 30% AMI. And the reality is that, you know, when you are asking the private market to provide a public good, you know, the private housing development market, there's just only so far it can go before it becomes unworkable for them. And so thinking about, you know, developing, thinking about feasibility is important. Y'all don't need me to get too much into community opposition, but we all know that particularly when it comes to affordable housing, some folks have some, you know, deep-seated fears of seeing folks of different income levels in their neighborhood. And, you know, there's messaging involved there. One of the things that will help quite a bit with that is that, you know, when the 3A district is, one of the requirements is that it be multifamily housing be allowed by right. So I would say that because that is going to be a component of all 3A districts, it's even more important that affordability be included, because that it eliminates a very major, or reduces, let's say, a very, very major barrier to developing affordable housing. And also just zoning restriction. And I'm seeing a chat here. Yes, the revised, the zoning restrictions in general, you know, it's harder to build affordability. Land is very expensive, and it's hard to build affordable housing when you can only build a couple of units an acre. Again, this is a great overlap with the 3A district because 3A districts already have a built-in density inherent in that. And there was a comment about the release date of the revised guidelines. That the revised guidelines were released October 21st of this year, not in October 21. So just to be clear. All right, next slide, please. So again, we're gonna talk briefly about two paths to get affordability in your district. Again, inclusionary zoning requires a certain percentage of units in new development to be affordable. I've gone through a lot of this already because it is a public good provided by the private market. We need to be really careful about the policy implications on development feasibility, because if a municipality asks for too much, then the developer simply won't build anything and no housing gets built at all, affordable housing or otherwise. And so that is the reason why DHCD has put some thresholds on the extent of the affordability that, the baseline extent of the affordability that can allow, and is asking for some sort of feasibility analysis of affordability beyond a certain level. Let's go on to the next slide. Just again, a couple things to keep in mind about inclusionary zoning. I say this about every policy, it's no silver bullet, but it's inclusionary zoning is a really great way to over time accumulate and a real substantial stock of affordable housing. Municipalities that adopted inclusionary zoning 20 years ago have a pretty substantial number of units built, and we're going to hear from one of the all-star inclusionary zoning communities in a little bit. And And again, because this is a market-based policy, it's not as effective as reaching those deepest affordability levels, like a 30% AMI without subsidy. But it is possible to reach like a 50 or 60% AMI. So again, all that is to say, encourage folks to think beyond the 80% AMI that's most typical. All right, next slide. And again, typically when we begin doing an inclusionary zoning analysis for a municipality, there's a lot of trade-offs that we talk about. You know, the number of affordable units required needs to balance with the depth of affordability. So there's kind of an inverse relationship. So you might be able to ask for, say, 10% of units affordable at 60% AMI, or 15% of units affordable at 80% AMI. But asking for both might push a little bit too far. So a lot of what we talk about when we talk about inclusionary zoning is asking communities to define what their priorities are. Is your priority to get as deep affordability as you can, or is your priority to get as many affordable units as you can? And either one is a legitimate goal. It depends on what the needs of your community are. And typically, when we are talking about inclusionary zoning with communities, we MAPC would recommend using cost offsets to push affordability as far as you possibly can. And that might mean reducing the amount of parking spaces requirement, a density bonus, fee waiver. And a lot of these things are kind of already baked into a 3A district. You know, if there's already a pretty decent density level that is, the 15 units per acre. That again, it depends based on community, but it's promising that might enable deeper affordability. A little more affordability. Again, so if you take away anything from this, it's that please don't let the feasibility ask be a deterrent from thinking about more affordability, because when we have density as high as 15 units an acre, there's many markets in which you could ask for more. Next slide, please. So, okay, and the second tool we're going to talk about is 40R smart growth zoning. And I know we have a couple of 40R experts from DHCD on the line. So if there's anything you want to throw in, please feel free to raise your hand and jump in. But the short story is the program is almost 20 years old. Happy birthday, 40R. And it is a type of state-enabled zoning that encourages municipalities to build compact, smart growth districts with an affordability requirement, typically 20%, that are located in areas where development makes sense, close to public transit or close to a village center, say. There are baseline densities that are required as part of a 40R district. You can see it varies based on the type of housing, but 12 units an acre for townhouses or 20 units an acre for condominiums. You can see that actually the average of that, aligns pretty well with a 3A requirement. So this is it's a good program that I'd encourage folks to think about as a path to 3A compliance. There's also something called a 40R starter home, which is intended for municipalities a little bit, further out or less dense, and that requires lower densities. That aligns a little less well with Section 3A, so we're not going to get into that here. But if you're interested, please do check out the 40R website. And again, for a 40R district, project must be allowed as of right with site plan review. Next slide. And in exchange for adopting this zoning, the state offers a lot of incentives, a lot of great incentives, financial incentives specifically, both when the district is adopted and when units are built. And so it's a really great tool to kind of address a lot of folks' concerns about potential impacts of new, more dense development. And again, 40R does allow for design standards. So even though the development must be allowed by right, there are mechanisms for a community to offer guidance to make sure that any new development fits in with their design goals and with the context of the community. Next slide, please. There have been some really, really cool examples of 40R districts. One of them, we'll hear more from folks in Reading about that one. The one in Northampton is just gorgeous. If you're, and looks like it could fit in so many, it feels like a village center in a small town. It's great. So anyways, I encourage you to take a look at what's possible. Even if you opt not to pursue a 40R district, just the images of the type of development that can happen with good planning and strong design guidelines, of, these are developments at density is roughly akin to what 3A requires, and they're beautiful. So again, if only for messaging, I strongly encourage you to check out some of these 40R districts. Next slide. And then beyond these, there's so many ways you can think about making affordability into what you're doing. There's one-off programs, like partnering with local nonprofits. There's a lot of municipalities that are recently looking at ways to use surplus land to release surplus land specifically for the development of affordable housing, and that goes a long way towards towards enabling deeper affordability. I know that Mass Housing has been doing a lot of work on that lately. So yeah, that's I'm going to run through these really quickly since you're all familiar with a lot of them. Looking at acquisition programs, just line items to support affordable housing. Next slide, please. For those who have CPA, make sure that you're spending the housing allocation. You can use funds either from your general fund or from CPA to buy down deeper affordability in 3A districts on a voluntary basis, which is a great way to kind of achieve deeper affordability, even if it's not required. For those of you that don't have CPA, consider adopting it. I know it's a big lift, but it's totally worth it's a phenomenal resource for local governments to pursue housing. Let's see, you all are familiar with the toolkit, but I just want to remind folks that, beyond what you are going to write into the zoning bylaw of your 3A district, there are a lot of tools that you can couple with that to achieve affordability on a one-off basis or encourage it. So please don't forget about those tools either. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Emma. And some folks have been putting questions in the chat already. Please continue to do so. We'll keep track of those. And then after the panelist discussion, we will throw your questions up for the Q&A. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Alexis. I am so pleased to welcome a few folks from the city of Watertown and the town of Reading. So from Watertown, we have Steve Magoon, who's the Assistant City Manager and Director of Community Development and Planning, and also Larry Field, who's the Senior Housing Planner. And from the town of Reading, we have Jean Delios, who's the Assistant Town Manager, and Andrew MacNichol, who's the Staff Planner. So again, thank you so much for joining. I first want to ask Watertown a few questions sort of about why you set your IZ policy in the ways that you did. So, you in Watertown, you need to have a project of at least 5 units to trigger the policy. And for smaller sizes, it's at 12.5% affordable. And then for 20 units or more, it's 15% affordable. So can you tell me kind of why you came to that decision to structure it that way?
Sure. Thank you. And Larry, feel free to jump in and add on anything I leave out or you think is important. But, our program kind of evolved. Initially, we had a 10% affordable requirement, and, it didn't take us too long to figure out that was treading water, not getting us closer to the 10% 40B requirement. So we increased it to 12.5%. Not too long after that, we were in the midst of a regional developing a zone, a regional mixed use zone, and really housing advocates advocated for a higher percentage, and we increased it to 15%, which quickly led to concerns about a level playing field. And so we expanded that citywide. So I think it made sense to get to 15%. Going back to the earlier conversation about trying to balance, not being overly burdensome. I think the other thought that came into our heads was, getting close to the levels that 40B required too. And, obviously didn't want to push projects into a 40B situation unnecessarily. So that's kind of how we ended up with the 15%. We did get a little pushback from developers, and the 12.5% for smaller project was part of that, accommodation that, the smaller the project, the less units they have to balance costs and other impacts. And so we did leave it at 12.5% for the smaller projects. So in a nutshell, I think that's kind of how we got to those numbers.
And then just to follow up about your policy and the income levels that you are utilizing. So Alexis spoke a lot about deeper affordability and how that is often needed to meet community need. And so how did Watertown come to require a percentage of units to be affordable to households at or below 65% AMI for the larger rental projects? And again, did you get any pushback from the development community on that?
We did get some pushback in terms of, making projects unfeasible. We did go ahead with a deeper subsidy. And I think that really came out of the conversation of our housing plan. And, again, that there is a greater need at some of the lower income levels. We also, got a lot of concern expressed about workforce housing and the slightly higher income levels. We decided to push for the 65% AMI to try and address some of those needs. And while recognizing the workforce housing need, decided that really wasn't something that we needed to pursue in our inclusionary policy. We could look at that in some other ways, particularly since that wouldn't get us closer to, our 40B exemption, wouldn't count towards our inventory. So we did include the lower provision but recognize the higher level needs as well.
Thank you. Now to ask the Reading folks kind of why Reading chose to utilize the smart growth program. And actually Reading has 2 smart growth districts for the downtown, and then there's a gateway district. So what made the municipality choose the 40R program over, a local overlay district?
Yeah, so I can jump in. Thank you, everyone. This has been a great webinar, and I'm very happy to be part of it. So Andrew, similarly, please feel free to jump in. But I've been in Reading now for 13 years and was the person that got to give the presentation to town meeting on adopting the downtown smart growth district, which you can imagine how much fun that was. But if you rewind the tape to where we were 13 years ago and how the real estate market was really down, to say the least. And Reading was struggling with its downtown, looking at some properties that really were ready for redevelopment, and developers that we had been in contact with approached the community and said, we really need different zoning to do what we want to do. And we had a closed small neighborhood grocery store that was so loved that it closed its doors, so now to redevelop that site, the zoning just didn't work for the downtown. Like many places, I see Kurt Bellavance on the call. Hi, Kurt from Peabody. So Kurt will remember that Peabody, like so many other downtowns, didn't allow housing in the downtown, and Reading was no different. So how can this be? Well, this is how it was. So the 40R smart growth zoning for the downtown really made a lot of sense because of the proximity. We are one of the few downtowns with a train station right smack in the downtown. It's a walkable neighborhood. We really like the idea of having the design guidelines piece of it to be able to have our planning commission actively involved in this. And so for all those reasons, the financial incentives were less of a priority, but they're certainly worth noting that that's another aspect of the program. And the ability to build our affordable housing and grow our downtown at the same time and get those units that we created on the subsidized housing inventory. Those were all the drivers. And it was our second smart growth district. We had done it a few years before that for a single property. It had done a 40R. So that's where we're at.
Great, thank you. To bounce back to Watertown, I want to ask you a little bit more about your policy and how you allow for payment in lieu of providing units, which is an option that many inclusionary zoning policies include. You know, as you mentioned, some projects, it's just really hard to make, even if it's just one unit on a smaller project, it's really hard to make that work. So can you tell us about your policy, which allows, I think, for projects of 5 to 10 units and above 10 units in extraordinary circumstances. So why did you allow for this payment in lieu for the smaller projects? And what are some cases in which it's been granted for larger projects?
Yeah, so we did have a couple of projects that did a fee in lieu, and we had some problems with that. And to be honest with you, I kind of wanted to eliminate it altogether, but we decided to keep it as a potential for smaller projects, again, recognizing that some smaller projects might not have the flexibility with number of units and things to accommodate particular circumstances. So we did leave that as a possibility for smaller projects. We have some language about, you know, exceptional or whatever for larger projects, but that hasn't been pursued. And the issue that we had with one project, they made their first payment, started building the project, ran into some financial issues. And as they wanted to go to CO for the last units, came back to the city and said, you know, we're really up against it financially. We can't afford to make this payment. And in my mind, that really, you know, caused the affordable housing payment in lieu to become sort of something at the end that you could consider or reconsider as opposed to, you know, a cost of doing the project. So when we made these revisions, really pushed to have that payment earlier in the process and up front. So it became part of the cost of the project as opposed to, you know, a fee that you have to pay later and, you know, puts some question about that into the discussion. So I don't think we'll have any fee in lieu for larger projects going forward, but still have that potential for a small project.
Great. I'd love to hear about some of the successes that you've had through these programs. So the folks in Reading, if you want to talk a little bit about that, you know, how many new units, how many affordable units. I'm also curious about the 40R payments. There seems to be a lot of kind of unknowns about how that all works. So if you could speak about some of the resources that the state has granted to Reading because of having a 40R district.
For sure, I can chime in, and similar, Jean, please jump in if I miss anything. But we've had a lot of success with 40R in our downtown district. We'll stick to for now on this topic. Our 10th 40R project is before the planning board right now. 8 have been approved. 1 is going under an appeal process due to some conditions placed on it, a bit convoluted there, but it's been very successful because 8 out of these 9 approved projects have been mixed use developments. They range from 3-unit townhouse to 12 units, 33 units, and some as high as 55 units. So we've got a nice mix there of density as well as bedrooms from 1, 2, and even 3-bedroom units in these developments. And we've heard through the local community that it's added foot traffic for the commercial spaces. And a number of the residents are involved in public engagement processes, town meetings, and more. So it's really been a big success and added to the community, because now we're able to pursue models such as our business improvement district that's ongoing, potential grants, additional streetscape improvements, and more. A total of 240 units just about have been approved so far, 51 of which are deeded affordable, so just over 21%. Many are rental projects that are required at the 25% affordability in Reading's case because we're a pre-existing district, and that helps on our SHI unit count. And the 40R district, as Jean has said, kind of helped us be more proactive and manage and locate this growth rather than reactive to a 40B development. In 2009, we were awarded $350,000 in the zoning incentive payment to develop the incentive units expected. Upon our expansion 5 years ago, we actually didn't enter up into the upper bracket, so we didn't get a new zoning incentive payment. And in short, I see Bill Rayalt and Elaine on here, so I hope I get this right. But in short, really, incentive units is the number of units allowed under the by right 40R, which is 20 units per acre minus the pre-existing zoned units. And in Reading's case, that was typically 0 because, as Jean mentioned, our business B didn't allow residential development. So we got that for capital improvements, and the same with density bonuses. Under 40R, you're awarded $3,000 for every bonus unit, which similar again is just in excess of the previous or existing zoned units. And again, in Reading's case was 0. So almost every unit we've developed has been a bonus unit. So just last year, we were awarded over $400,000 in density payment bonuses because we had so many projects coming on at the same time. And that's been substantial because we can use it for capital improvements and planning in the downtown and affordable housing developments. So not only that, outside of the state programs and financial incentives, a lot of the redevelopments were on vacant or very underutilized parcels. So we've seen just under $1 million in new growth tax revenue from these developments, which again has helped schools in town. So that's where we're at now, and we're still hoping for more, planning for more, and happy to answer any questions.
Well, one follow-up question I have, you mentioned that there were a few projects that didn't get approved. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the circumstances under which they were denied, because I think, you know, it's especially relevant for Section 3A because it'll be structured pretty similarly in terms of, you know, only allowing for the limited review.
Yeah. So Reading's bylaw, again, being a bit older than some of the other new model bylaws, we have some flexibility on our waivers in terms of density. This one specific lot was very challenging in being located at the edge of our downtown district at the busiest intersection in town, and if not the most dangerous, top 3 most dangerous intersection in town. So the combination of access and circulation and other challenges, just the planning board didn't feel the density was justified, so we conditioned down to by right, and that's been appealed. So it's going through that process. Like many other types of plan review, site specifics are challenge, grading changes, intersections in traffic, access and circulation. And this one, I just don't think met some of the waiver justification that other projects previously had.
And ironically, that same site is adjacent to an approved and very successful 40R project that the developer tried to purchase the site and incorporate it in, and they couldn't work that out either. So the natural progress of things should have been that those sites were combined, and now you have an even better project than the one that did get built, approved and built. So difficult property owners show themselves to us all the time.
I'm sure everyone, most people on this call are familiar with that. But I think it's important to show that, you know, if a project is really not a good project for that location, it does, you know, it doesn't make sense for infrastructure reasons, public safety, you know, those are still conditions under which a site plan review project can be denied. So I'd like to ask the same question I asked before regarding the success of the policy to the Watertown folks. So if you can talk about how many affordable units you have created, and I'm also curious about how many fees you've generated through the payment in lieu system.
Now, Larry, I'll let you jump in on this one first.
Great. So about 400 affordable units have been created under the inclusionary zoning ordinance.
And that's in how many years?
Well, the ordinance has been in place for decades, but most of the development we're talking about is since there were a couple of them before the Great Recession, so 2004, 2006, and then after the Great Recession, so picking up in 2011. So the vast bulk of them have been in the last 11 years.
Okay.
And that's just market conditions. The zoning was generally in place, but at the time, I think Watertown was not viewed as attractive a place for residential development. And so it has only been in the last 10 years or so that that's really taken off. And we had a little bit of a lull during the COVID period, but now we have two developments that are likely to be proposed in the next few months in Watertown Square, and they're large enough to be hitting the inclusionary zoning threshold. What we've found is that there are really very few projects that are hitting the 6 to 10 unit range, and even the 10 to 19 that are the smaller projects. We tend to either have condo projects that are smaller, that's a few of those that fit into the 6 to 10 range, or rental or condo that are much larger. The scale that we're getting is usually well over 100. And so we haven't been picking up a lot of money from the payment in lieu.
Because you've been getting units mostly?
No, but because we have very few projects that are in that range.
Got it. Because it's only the smaller projects that automatically qualify unless there's extraordinary circumstances. Is that correct?
Well, so no, what, so from 6 to 10, essentially those are small infill or conversions of space condo projects, and they're interested in doing payment in lieu instead of having an on-site unit. And that's where we've got, I think the number of like 5 or 6 of them that have been created over the life of the ordinance. Then when we're talking about the large projects, we haven't had any waivers, no one who has been able to make payments in lieu instead of providing the units. The ordinance says that it has to be, quote, extraordinary circumstances, end quote, and that it is they have to show that it would be the best interests of the city's affordable housing needs for that to happen. So that's a pretty tough standard to meet.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to make sure that we have some time to answer questions from the attendees. So I think maybe if we want to open it up, I think Alexis, we can kind of shift between questions that might be for us and for the municipal folks. Because I think we have some questions from sort of the beginning that are more related to our presentation. So
Yeah, absolutely.
address everything.
I think there was several questions or comments and questions from a few different people about citing specifically that 40B developments can and do happen with a 25% affordability requirement, and that's been proven to be feasible. So why is the limit here only 10%? I know I can throw out a couple of things, and then I also want to punt it back to our panelists to hear their thoughts as well. But I'll just start off by saying that that whatever is required in a 3A district has to be feasible across all project types within the district. A lot of 40Bs, most 40Bs are large, 100+ unit developments that are, not necessarily the missing middle housing types. Whereas if you got a lot of smaller lots in your 3A district, the affordability requirement needs to work for those too. And folks have already kind of talked a little bit about how, smaller projects are harder to do. And so the requirement needs to work for smaller projects as well. Another thing that comes to mind is that 40Bs are often developed on real large lots that are maybe on the edge of town or further away from downtown. And that's, not necessarily where the 3A district is going to be. It's a lot harder and a lot more expensive to develop near transit or near a village center. And so that's another thing that needs to be taken into account. I will say it's, precisely because we know that it is doable in 40R districts or through 40Bs. That's why I would encourage folks to consider going beyond the 10% and 80% AMI. There'll be technical assistance available to do that. But again, I strongly encourage folks not to limit themselves to 10%, 80%. But I'm going to first kind of turn this question around and ask the folks in Watertown, how, if we're talking about it being feasible for 40B developers, at least to do, 20-25% affordability, how would a 20 or 25% affordability have worked out in your town? Like when you were developing the ordinance, what were you hearing from people about the percentages that you did have? And, do you think you could have pushed it further?
I would offer a couple things. One big difference, I think, with the 40B project is while it's 25% affordable, it also is by right, and it also doesn't have to comply with the rest of your zoning regulations. So, while the market may say it's X number of dollars per unit of development potential, you can get more development potential than that by going 40B. And so you can, make the project more financially feasible by increasing your density and reducing the unpredictability, which is what most developers and most financial, people financing development are most concerned about. So, I think a 40B at 25% is not equal to a market rate project at 25%. Having said that, could we bump ours up a little? I wouldn't say that would make projects unfeasible. But I think that the market changes from time to time, and there are an awful lot of market forces that make things feasible or unfeasible. A lot of our larger projects have been pushed out financially because the properties that have been able to be developed by lab buildings have all been scooped up by lab developers. We're paying much more for the land than residential developers can. I think things like that, market forces and what lenders are lending for are as important, if not more important than, whether we're setting it at 15% or 18% or 12.5%. Yeah.
So when you're talking about a policy that applies to an entire district, there's more forces at play than there might be for a individual parcel 40B development.
Yes.
It sounds great.
I would agree.
Thanks.
May I add one quick point, which is, and there are often other amenities you would like to have a project add, and increasingly environmental ones and energy ones are important, and you lose control over that if you are going the 40B route.
Right. And I see from Katie Lacey from MHP also has said that most 40B projects do have some financial subsidy, so that factors in as well. And I also want to hear the Reading folks' perspective. A 40R district requires far more than 10% affordability, the 20 or 25% affordability, and stuff is getting built under 40R. So for the Reading folks, what is it? Is there anything about the 40R district in your experience from the projects that you've seen built that is making this affordability level possible where it might not otherwise have been possible?
I think that the attractiveness of putting housing in a walkable community next to a train station is what we have going for us. The rents that they're getting, I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. The market rents can cover what's happening with the affordables. And like Andrew pointed out, we're at 25% for rentals. So that's on the higher side, and there's no issue with it. They don't even blink an eye.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen, we got our larger anchor projects, those 50, 55 units, a few sites. And now as some of these smaller ones come online, we do have a lot of small parcels in our downtown, as you alluded to, potentially in 3A for a number of communities. And those smaller parcels having a lot more challenges actually are sticking to 12 units or less and not triggering affordability requirements, which has been a challenge because we know we need to maintain 20% across the district. And just the last handful have come in at 7, 12 units, no affordable units. While they might be considered workforce and smaller in size and nature, they don't account on our SHI or affordability requirements. So that's just the challenge of small lots and financial feasibility on them.
Yeah, great, thanks. So lots of stuff to think about, certainly. There was a question about the Watertown specific numbers, which I believe was answered in the chat. And a question about how DHCD will be determining feasibility. Again, this is something that DHCD is still working out. There will be more specific guidance coming out, in the coming soon. I believe Nate and Chris Kletchen are both on the call. If you have anything to add to that, please feel free to raise your hand. But otherwise, I would just say stay tuned. There will be more specific and detailed guidance coming soon. Another question about if existing affordable units can, might be at risk of or can be abandoned if they're in an MBTA district that has a lower affordability requirement. I would say no, as long as there's a deed restriction and there's an existing unit in place, that deed restriction stands. And the deed restriction, is grandfathered through any, affordable, any requirement that might be in place for new development. And let's see, there was a question about 40S funding, which is the funding that's available through 40R specifically to offset the cost of, to offset school impacts, which I believe Bill also answered in the chat. Thank you, Bill. I'm glad that you're here today. Bill, if there's anything you would like to add to that, please raise your hand and you can jump in. And let's see, there was another comment about a prohibition, prohibition on the 3A does not allow municipalities to regulate unit size, and how that might, a concern that might result in only one bedrooms being built. I'm going to, again, give a start of an answer and then pass it over to our panelists. Just because you are not allowed to require certain, or limit unit sizes doesn't mean that you can't incentivize it. A lot of municipalities use incentives to encourage greater affordability. The same could absolutely be true for larger units, both in terms of allowing through zoning and dimensional allowances, or through the types of housing that are allowed. Townhouses are a great family type, and specifically addressing townhouses in your bylaw, will be one way to encourage family units. And also and I just want to make clear, and again, folks from DHCD, feel free to raise your hand and jump in. But the capacity targets are totally independent of what ultimately gets built. So regardless of what the capacity targets assume about unit size, a developer can choose to build, or a town can choose to incentivize a far greater share of larger units. So what gets built on the ground doesn't have to, conform lockstep with the capacity targets. And I will just throw it over to our panelists. If you've seen any trends in terms of family size units versus, you know, a greater proportion of 1-bedroom units? And if there's anything in your bylaw or just in market trends that has been, and has encouraged or not encouraged, family size units? Either Reading or Watertown.
I would say that we've encouraged more family size housing, and at least initially, we got some surprise from developers that they tended to have communities not want family size housing because of the school impacts. But as we asked for that, you know, we'd get that. So I think there is more of a trend towards more of that, not less of it. But developers left to their own devices, I think, are going more studios and 1-bedrooms and you know, more units to generate income from.
Yeah, that's what we've seen. Units versus bedrooms is a different metric, right? So 2-bedroom, we've gone more 2-bedrooms than 1-bedrooms, fortunately, which has been great, but in a good mix across the board of these projects. But
and was that as a result of anything that the town did to encourage that, or was that just how it?
I think that was just how it played out in the market itself and what they were looking for, as well as knowing what we're looking for downtown.
Right, thanks. There was another question about, can a community pass a 40R district to comply with 3A? I'm going to hedge a little. There are a few differences in the kind of specifics in terms of, you know, what type of housing is defined. And so having a 40R district doesn't automatically mean that it will be 3A compliant. But if you're intentionally crafting a 40R district with 3A compliance in mind, you know, there are pathways where that could be achieved. So I would say, Bill Ray already put his contact information in the chat. You know, please feel free to reach out to DHCD if you're considering 40R as a vehicle to 3A compliance. It definitely could be. You just have to make sure you're checking a couple of the boxes. Let's see, and I'm going to take, I missed the last couple of things in the chat here. I don't know if Emma, if you've seen any chat coming up and you want to chime in, or if anyone else has anything to chime in. Otherwise, I'm going to just skim back a little bit.
This is going until 1:30.
Let's see. Requirement of not more than. All right, sorry, I'm just taking a moment to read through the questions. Let's see, there was a question about adjacent communities. And I think in terms of adjacent communities, that there's a lot of guidance about how adjacent communities comply, and a lot that has changed in the final guidance versus what was originally put out. So I think this question is more about requirements generally. I would just refer folks to the guidelines and to read them. There's a lot of flexibility for adjacent communities in terms of how they might apply, and also in terms of the unit capacity calculations. So for that, I think unless there's a specific question about affordability in adjacent communities, I'll refer folks to the guidelines. And since there's a lot of changes in the final guidelines that address the concerns of adjacent communities. In terms of someone's asked about incentives. I would say I'll put that back over to the panelists. Have either of you used incentives to encourage developers to go beyond what's required, either in terms of asking for greater affordability or family units, as the case may be?
I would say we've tried to do that in some cases, but generally speaking, they haven't been taken advantage of. And, you know, it's always a very a challenge to fine tune incentives to make sure you're not giving away too much or creating an incentive that's worthwhile to a developer. So that really hasn't been so much an important part of the equation for us.
I would echo that as well. We have a waiver process for 40Rs based on density and other dimensional factors, and we've granted waivers for density and height and other areas. But typically, we haven't historically seen or gotten more affordability because of them. We've looked for public amenities like open space, energy efficiency, and other.
Yeah, I think that's consistent. Speaking only to inclusionary zoning now, but in general, in inclusionary zoning that is voluntary and incentive based tends to be a lot less, produce a lot less affordable units than something that's required. But that's not to say it's not something that this is a new program. That's not to say it's not something that couldn't be considered. And I think incentive actually could work really well in terms of encouraging family units, since that's a little bit less of a little bit less of a direct financial calculation. Let's see. Somebody said that wanted to clarify the requirement that of providing 10% or the guideline that a requirement greater than 10% of units at 80% AMI does apply to the requirement to demonstrate feasibility for districts asking for greater than 10% affordability at 80% MI does apply even to municipalities that already have inclusionary zoning beyond that that level in place. And again, DHCD folks, feel free to raise your hand and step in. Bill, go ahead. Bill Rail is with DHCD. Oh, and is on mute. Oh, still can't hear you. If you want to, feel free to type something in the chat, but in general, many municipalities that have gone beyond that have already done feasibility studies. And again, DHCD is still working out exactly what the requirements will be. But having done that already, is certainly a step in the right direction. But to be clear, even if a municipality already has an existing IZ policy that goes beyond the 10%, 80% AMI, they will still need to have document feasibility, with the exception of a 40R district, which may have been what Bill was going to say. If you have an existing 40R district with greater affordability, then there's kind of that applies differently. But if you just have general inclusionary zoning requirements citywide without 40R, then the municipality would need to demonstrate feasibility in order for those requirements to be applicable in the 3A district. And let's see, was a question for Reading. Was Reading content to have housing, exclusively residential housing only development in its central area as opposed to mixed use development?
So as I mentioned, 8 of our projects are mixed use with varying commercial spaces. 40R inherently is multifamily by right. However, based on our bylaw, multifamily only, you're allowed a max height of 33 feet. With mixed use, you're allowed 45 feet. So that really allows developers, and they know that we're looking for commercial space in our development in our commercial center. It's a waiver justification. So they come in, I think, knowing that. We explain that to them. And what it allows them to do is put the commercial and parking on the first floor, and it doesn't really impact their amount of residential space above. They still get the same 3 stories of residential, but it's a little less impacted. And that's a challenge for us because more residential means more parking, which means less commercial space, right? Because it eats into that ground floor area. So we play that game. We have those conversations. We're always asking for more commercial space because we know it's important. We know we need it. We desire it. And we've gotten it. So that's really what we ask for, and what we get a lot of is mixed use.
Any tips for balancing the parking requirements with the other goals?
Geez, it's hard. Parking is always a hot topic, as I'm sure you all know. We get a lot of asks for more parking, for guest parking, and overnight parking, and so on. But look for the at-grade and creative changes, shared parking, below grade parking, anything that can help save space on the ground floor. Utilities rooms being below grade if possible in a basement to save space on the ground floor has helped create a few hundred square feet here and there. But it is a challenge, admittedly.
Yeah, that's actually a really good example of an effective use of incentives, which we were talking about earlier. A 3A district cannot require ground floor commercial use, but allowing a full extra story is a pretty strong incentive to encourage it. So again, that example is about encouraging mixed use, but I think the same concept could be applied to affordability or to family units. And thanks, Nate. Just to be very clear, if you want the details or the straight from the horse's mouth, the affordability requirements are outlined in section B or section 4B of the guidance, and I'll put a link to that in the chat in 1 second. But the affordability section is only 2 or 3 paragraphs long, and it's pretty clear. So again, if you have any questions, I would start by checking that out.
Just to keep an eye on the time, because I know MHP has some closing remarks. I think let's just read through Bill's response, because I think it's helpful. And then I think I'll just answer Sunny's question, just reaffirming that, yes, if a community currently has 15% AMI, affordability requirements, they will need to demonstrate feasibility because it's over 10%. That is a change since the guidelines first came out. Bill basically says that a lot of the production of 40R has been in site-specific districts, i.e. a developer is creating a density bonus like 40B that can help cover costs of affordable units. With the exception of Reading and Northampton, not as much production in our larger multi-parcel districts. So don't think unsubsidized 20 to 25% affordability is a slam dunk by any means. That's a good point. Really important to consider the local market that you're operating in. And I think with that, probably is a good time to hand it off to Claire to close out the whole webinar series.
I know, can you believe it? Let me go ahead and share my screen with you all. So yes, as Emma stated, this is the final session of our 10-week series. We'd like to thank Alexis, Emma, and our wonderful panelists for a great presentation to close out the series. We also want to thank our audience for your thoughtful questions and comments. Just want to put out a quick note for those interested AICP members. We've put together a tip sheet on self-reporting CM credits. This resource can be found at the bottom of the Housing Toolbox page for this series under related resources. That link will be in the chat. If you have any questions regarding that, please contact myself or Emma at MHP if you're finding any issues finding that document. And post this presentation, we will be sending out a recap email in the coming week with this information as well. So again, thank you those who have attended some of the 10 sessions, all of the 10 sessions. Hope you all found it very useful and hope you all have a great day. Thank you.